Good morning, I'm Nicky Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. We're back in Leith Academy in Edinburgh to debate one very big question. Are nuclear weapons ever justified? When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it and argue about what to do about it only after you've had your technical success. That is the way it was with the atomic bomb. The words of Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project, which developed the first atomic bomb. And ever since it was dropped on Japan 70 summers ago, the nations of the world have been arguing over what to do about it ever since. To Mrs. Thatcher, the Iron Lady, a world without nuclear weapons would be less stable and more dangerous for us all. But Colin Powell, former four-star American general and George W. Bush's Secretary of State, he believed a world without nuclear weapons would be a much better place. So which is right? What is undeniably true is that strategic long-range nuclear weapons bearing over 16,000 warheads of awesome destructive power exist in the arsenals of at least 9 countries, enough to blow the world to smithereens many times over. So we've gathered together some of the world's leading experts on nuclear deterrence, nuclear disarmament and international affairs, alongside philosophers, campaigners, plus political and military supporters and opponents of Trident to debate this today. And you can have your say via Twitter or online. Just log on to bbc.co.uk/thebigquestions, where you will find links to continue the discussion online. And lots of encouragement and contributions for our very engaged, as ever, Edinburgh audience. So are nuclear weapons ever justified? Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society. Is there a moral case for these weapons of mass destruction?
Well, it's a big question to open with, Nicky, so allow me to give you an even bigger answer to that, in the sense of, because it's what are you talking about by nuclear weapons here? Are you talking about strategic weapons? Are you talking about tactical nuclear weapons? Are you talking about possession? Are you talking about use? Are you talking about specific circumstances? Are you talking about generalities? I think the opening you gave sums up the debate in total. I think you look at some things and go, actually, it would be better if nuclear weapons had never been invented. But the fact is they have been invented, they exist. How are we going to deal with that is a struggle for our generation, previous generations, future generations going forwards. Now, I can give you plenty of examples where I feel, even use would be justified. The 1945 case, I'm sure we'll look at that in that example, compared to what you might have had they not been available or been utilised in that instance. I can also give you plenty where they're not. And I think one of the benefits of a full discussion on this, and may I say how good it is to see that we are having a discussion on British primetime television on this, will, I think, tease out some of the answers for that.
If we had not had a nuclear arsenal which exceeded that of the Soviet Union during the 50s, 60s and 70s and 80s, do you seriously think we would have been obliterated?
Well, I think there are numbers involved in all of this. Did we need as many as we did? Perhaps not. The question, though, is, it's quite clear that the concept of mutually assured destruction had some role, at least, to play in stopping the Soviet Union, at least in the early days, from expanding its influence.
So, if we hadn't had that arsenal, do you think the world now would be a very different place?
Yes, I think we would. I think if one side had nuclear weapons, absolutely. If it had been their side, absolutely. They would have just rolled over, and, well, the whole of Europe would certainly have been communist for a long time. I think that's indisputable. If you look at the concept of deterrence, when you look at what we had in terms of stopping them that way, it's quite clear that was a major factor in calculations. And of course, the world eventually realised that to calibrate, to look at this, if you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, for example, I think both sides realised they were at the brink. What were they going to do here? And they pulled back, and that's a key thing.
Well, you mentioned Hiroshima. Alan, you wanted to come back in here.
I think there may be 2 problems, Mary, with your approach on that. I mean, I think the first is that when it comes to your argument for neither bombing nor nuclear weapons to end the Second World War, how would you have ended it then? The only alternative would have been an extraordinarily bloody assault on Japan, which they'd already seen from the piece-by-piece sort of move across the Pacific Ocean, and latterly the Okinawa invasion in particular. They knew it was coming for them. They knew the immense loss of life that would have led that way for American soldiers and presumably others who would have engaged in that. I think it's very difficult to argue how you would have ended the war without utilising one of those efforts there. And the second argument, I think you're perhaps confusing a dangerous person with being irrational in that context. I think both Hitler and Stalin were clearly dangerous. They may have been mad in that sense, but they seem to look at rationality in slightly different ways. I mean, had Hitler been deterred at an earlier stage, it's quite possible he would have been deterred. Logically, who knows? But we
can
didn't
I
do
ask
that.
you a
And
question?
Stalin in particular was deterred. If you look at Berlin 1948, he could quite easily have launched a war at that point, but he did not do so.
If your argument is the world would be better had the world nuclearly disarmed
That
its
was the
nuclear
question
weapons.
Nikki asked.
If that's your, well, okay, well, if there were no nuclear weapons now, the world, quite clearly, would be a better place. But I think the mistake, if I may, of supporters of CND is the idea that one side, the UK, could disarm and then the world would be a safer place, because I think that just rests on a total fallacy that the UK can provide. Well, I'm not using that word.
I'm still saying it rests on a total fallacy.
Yeah.
You think it's naive? Alan, let me come in. I'm going to ask you a question so you have a chance to say. But don't say I want to go back to the previous question.
Well, it's sort of, we like, you see, you like
Alan,
historical things.
Alan, we are on that. What would you say to these unilateralists here, Mary and John?
I'm also a multilateralist.
Right. Well, I think it goes back to the reading of history. We can argue about history, we can look at how things work, but one thing we can't change is to look at what détente led to. Détente did not lead to a magical sort of time when we all came together and held hands and sang Kumbaya. Détente in the 1970s led to the biggest aggression from the Soviets that we'd seen for many years when they started moving into Afghanistan, into Africa and everywhere else. That was what they took from détente. They took the lesson we were weakening and that they could push their claims, and that's a problem with that kind of approach. It leads to that. Gorbachev case comes a lot later than that. In between the time you were talking about, the early 80s were marked by immense hostility between America and Russia, between Brezhnev, the falling regime, then Andropov and his paranoia, versus Reagan in that way. Only latterly, when the Soviets realised that disaster was coming, when they realised disaster was coming, they had no choice but to come to the table and start to negotiate seriously.
I mean, do you really want the West to be nuclear-free at this moment in history now?
Well, there's different issues, whether the West as a whole should be nuclear-free, which we can't do much about.
Would you like, ideally, America to be...
Well, I'd like a nuclear-free world. Something we can do something about in the immediate short term, of course, is the United Kingdom's so-called independent
if you
nuclear
wave
deterrent.
your magic, John Nicholson won, would you like America to have no nuclear weapons right now?
That's so inconceivable that it's a fundamentally pointless discussion to have, because it's not going to happen. I'm much more interested in what the United Kingdom. I'm much more interested in what the United Kingdom.
It goes to the heart of it. It goes to the heart of it because it's all very well speaking about unilateral disarmament as an easy answer, but actually, if you're serious about a nuclear-free world, which I think actually everyone on the panel would like to see, I think everyone on the panel would like to see that, you have to engage with the other argument.
Mendoza, is there not an argument for getting rid of Trident?
Well, there is an argument, but I feel if you're going to go for the nuclear side of things, you're saying we are going to be a nuclear power, then you need to get the best in class for that. And as we know, the point of the Trident system is to ensure you always have that ultimate deterrence. We know what happens if you have the halfway house of missile bases. We know you have the halfway house of, airstrips and bombers having missiles. They can be taken out if necessary in that context. The point of having the submarine deterrent, which is why it's the gold standard, is that it can't be taken out. That deterrent exists, and that comes down to threat.
But we're not spending that money on conventional
Wait a second,
defense.
but it comes down to threat. Here's the whole point. It's been stated on this programme that there are no threats conceivably that could affect Britain in 5, 10 years. That is crazy talk, and I'm sorry it is. If you look at what's happening with Russia, if you look at what's happening potentially with Iran, the antipathy the Iranians have for the British, not the other way around, but the Iranians historically have for the British, if they were to get a nuclear weapon, who knows what that would be used for. And finally, the issue of radical Islamists getting hold perhaps of the Pakistani bomb or something similar in that regard. Then all of us become targets. It's not just Britain, everyone in that sense.